A tech company CEO walks through his gleaming corporate headquarters, past the football tables and meditation rooms, toward the company cafeteria that serves free gourmet meals to all employees. He's proud of this cafeteria. It cost $2 million to build, employs professional chefs, offers everything from vegan options to international cuisine, and it's supposed to represent his company's commitment to employee wellness and community. But as he observes the lunch rush, he notices something that's been nagging at him for weeks. There are virtually no black women in the cafeteria. His company employs 43 black women across various departments, and he can count on one hand how many he's ever seen eating in this space that's meant to serve everyone. At first, he assumes they must bring lunch from home or eat at their desks. But over several weeks of observation, he notices these same women leaving the building during lunch hours, walking blocks away to restaurants, spending their own money and their limited lunch break traveling elsewhere to eat. Why would employees skip a free, high-quality cafeteria? Why would they choose to spend money and time going elsewhere when convenient food was provided? The CEO could have ignored this pattern, could have assumed it wasn't his concern, could have told himself that people have their preferences. Instead, he did something that would expose systemic problems in his company and transform how he understood workplace inclusion. He asked, and the answer he received didn't just change his cafeteria. It changed his entire approach to leadership and revealed how companies can fail their employees in ways they never intended and never noticed. Let me introduce you to David Morrison, because this CEO's story is based on real experiences that multiple leaders have shared about discovering invisible exclusions in their organizations. David was the founder and CEO of TechVision, a software company in Austin, Texas, that had grown from a startup to a mid-sized firm with 350 employees over 8 years. David considered himself a progressive leader who cared about diversity and inclusion. His company had explicit policies against discrimination, diversity goals in hiring, and regular training on cultural sensitivity. The company's demographics were better than many tech firms. 18% of employees were black, compared to the tech industry average of around 7%. David had celebrated this in board meetings, had featured diverse employees in recruiting materials, and genuinely believed his company was doing better than most at creating an inclusive workplace. The cafeteria had been one of David's proudest initiatives, launched 3 years earlier as part of the company's commitment to employee wellness. The concept was simple but generous: provide high-quality, nutritious meals to all employees at no cost, eliminating the stress of figuring out lunch, reducing time wasted on food acquisition, and creating a communal space where employees from different departments could interact and build relationships. The cafeteria was designed by award-winning architects, featured an open kitchen where chefs prepared food in full view, offered rotating menus with options for every dietary restriction, and included comfortable seating areas designed to encourage both quick meals and lingering conversations. Employee surveys showed high satisfaction ratings for the cafeteria, and David had assumed it was universally appreciated. But then David started actually paying attention to who was using the space and who wasn't. It began when he overheard 2 black women employees talking near the elevator about where they were going for lunch, a restaurant 15 minutes away. David found this curious since the cafeteria offered better food at no cost closer by. Over the next few weeks, he started observing patterns during lunch hours. The cafeteria was always bustling, filled with mostly white and Asian employees chatting, eating, and relaxing. But the black women he knew worked at the company were conspicuously absent. He checked with HR to confirm his observation wasn't just sampling bias. They pulled badge access data showing that while 91% of employees used the cafeteria at least weekly, only 12% of black women employees did. The disparity was stark and troubling, but David didn't understand what was causing it. David's first instinct was to send out an anonymous survey asking about cafeteria satisfaction, but his chief people officer, Angela Martinez, suggested a different approach. Angela, a Latina woman who'd built her career in HR at tech companies, knew from experience that anonymous surveys often failed to surface the real issues, especially when those issues involved race and feeling unsafe or unwelcome. She suggested that David directly ask some of the black women employees why they weren't using the cafeteria, but to do it in a way that made clear he was genuinely seeking to understand and improve rather than checking a diversity box or looking for someone to blame. Angela emphasized that this conversation required building trust first. Black employees, particularly black women who face unique combinations of racial and gender bias, had learned through experience to be cautious about sharing concerns with leadership, because speaking up about race-related issues often resulted in being labeled difficult, being excluded from opportunities, or facing retaliation. David took Angela's advice and started by building relationships. He scheduled one-on-one coffee meetings with several black women at various levels of the company, not specifically about the cafeteria, but about their experiences at TechVision generally, what was working well, what could be improved, how supported they felt in their roles. These conversations were illuminating in ways David hadn't expected. He heard about microaggressions that happened regularly but were invisible to him, being interrupted in meetings, having ideas dismissed until a white colleague proposed the same thing, being assumed to be more junior than they actually were, being excluded from informal networks where real decisions and opportunities happened. He learned about the emotional labor these women did constantly, managing white colleagues' discomfort when race came up, educating others about bias while trying to do their actual jobs, moderating their tone and appearance to avoid stereotypes about angry black women. After several of these conversations had built some trust, David finally asked the question he'd been curious about. "I've noticed that many black women at the company don't seem to use our cafeteria, and I'm trying to understand why. Is there something about that space that doesn't work for you?" The first woman he asked this directly, a senior engineer named Jasmine Carter, paused for a long moment before responding. She looked at David carefully, seemingly evaluating whether he actually wanted to hear the truth or whether this was a trap. Finally, she said something that would stay with David for the rest of his career. "Do you really want to know? Because if I tell you the truth, it's going to make you uncomfortable, and it's going to require you to acknowledge some things about this company that might challenge how you see yourself as a leader." David assured Jasmine that he genuinely wanted to understand, that he was asking because he wanted to fix whatever was wrong, and that he wouldn't penalize honesty even if it was uncomfortable. Jasmine took a breath and explained. The cafeteria, for all its gourmet food and beautiful design, felt like a hostile space for black women. Not overtly hostile, nobody was telling them they weren't welcome, but hostile in dozens of subtle ways that accumulated into a clear message that this space wasn't really for them. She described walking into the cafeteria and seeing mostly white faces, sitting at tables that were already segregated by department and race, even though nobody had assigned seating. She talked about the discomfort of being one of the only black people in a crowded room, feeling hypervisible and scrutinized. She explained how conversations would sometimes stop when she approached a table, or how she'd sit down with colleagues who would make awkward comments that revealed they saw her primarily as black, rather than as a full human and colleague. Jasmine described specific incidents that had made the cafeteria feel unwelcoming. There was the time she'd overheard white colleagues at the next table making jokes that relied on racial stereotypes, and when she'd visibly reacted, they'd looked at her like she was the problem for not finding it funny. There was the pattern of white employees talking loudly about expensive vacations, investment properties, and luxury purchases, class signaling that reminded her that many of her colleagues came from wealth, while she was still paying off student loans and supporting family members. There were the conversations about golf, sailing, and other activities that marked membership in social classes and communities, she'd never been part of. There was the time a white colleague had reached out and touched her hair without permission, commenting on its texture like she was an object to be examined. There was the persistent feeling that she was being watched and judged more harshly than others, that if she was on her phone, people assumed she was slacking, while white colleagues doing the same thing were assumed to be working. But beyond these specific incidents, Jasmine explained something more fundamental. The cafeteria represented a kind of forced socialization that required emotional labor she didn't want to spend on her lunch break. Eating there meant being on, managing how she was perceived, code-switching her language and mannerisms, being ready to educate white colleagues who asked ignorant questions about race, representing all black people in conversations, navigating microaggressions while trying to enjoy her food. It meant sitting in a space where she felt like she didn't fully belong, where her blackness made her stand out rather than blend in, where she was reminded constantly that this company and this industry weren't built for people like her. Going to a restaurant off-site, even if it cost money and time, meant getting a real break where she could drop the performance and just exist without scrutiny. It meant eating in peace without wondering if someone was going to make an uncomfortable comment or ask her to explain something about black culture. It meant protecting her mental health by limiting exposure to an environment that, however unintentionally, signaled that she was other. David listened to Jasmine's explanation with growing discomfort, exactly as she'd predicted. His first instinct was to defend, to point out that he'd never intended the cafeteria to feel exclusionary, that the company had diversity training, that surely these incidents were isolated rather than patterns. But he'd asked for honesty, and Jasmine was giving it to him. He thanked her for sharing, asked if she'd be willing to help him understand the problem better, and requested permission to talk to other black women at the company about their experiences. Jasmine agreed but warned him, "You're going to hear things that make you uncomfortable. You're going to learn that this company isn't as inclusive as you thought it was. The question is whether you're going to actually do something about it or whether this is just performative curiosity." David scheduled confidential conversations with 15 other black women employees, and what he heard was both consistent and devastating. Every single one described similar feelings about the cafeteria, that it felt like white space where they were tolerated but not truly welcome, where they had to work hard to manage perceptions and navigate microaggressions, where the mental cost of eating there exceeded the benefit of free food. They described the cafeteria as a microcosm of the broader company culture, a place where the surface diversity of having black employees present masked the reality that systems, norms, and social dynamics had been designed by and for white employees. They talked about feeling lonely even when surrounded by colleagues, about having to choose between eating alone and feeling isolated or joining tables where they'd be the only black person and feel hypervisible. One woman, Keisha Williams, described the phenomenon of the spotlight effect, that whenever she was in the cafeteria, she felt like her behavior was being observed and judged in ways that white colleagues' behavior wasn't. If she ate alone, people assumed she was antisocial or couldn't fit in. If she ate with other black employees, people assumed they were self-segregating or not team players. If she ate with white colleagues, she felt like she had to be extra careful about her behavior to avoid confirming stereotypes. The calculation was exhausting, and avoiding the cafeteria was simply easier. Another woman, Tamara Johnson, explained that the food itself sometimes felt exclusionary. The rotating menus featured lots of European and Asian cuisine, but rarely included foods from African, Caribbean, or soul food traditions, sending a subtle message about whose food culture was worthy of representation. The chefs, all white, weren't familiar with these cuisines, and when Tamara had suggested adding them to the rotation, she'd been told they'd consider it, but nothing had ever changed. Several women mentioned that the cafeteria's culture of lingering and socializing during lunch, something David had explicitly encouraged as good for building cross-departmental relationships, was itself exclusionary. The white employees who stayed in the cafeteria after eating, playing foosball or chatting, were often building informal networks that led to opportunities and advancement. They were bonding with colleagues from other teams, establishing relationships that would later translate into better projects, promotions, and support. By avoiding the cafeteria, the black women were missing these networking opportunities, but the alternative, spending extra unpaid time in a space where they felt unwelcome, was even more costly to their well-being. They were caught in a trap where avoiding the exclusionary space protected their mental health, but potentially harmed their careers, while using the space might help their careers, but at significant psychological cost. David was shaken by these conversations. He'd thought of himself as a good leader who cared about inclusion, and he'd built what he thought was a generous, thoughtful amenity that would benefit all employees. Instead, he'd created a space that reinforced existing exclusions and made some employees feel more isolated and unwelcome. The cafeteria wasn't malicious. Nobody was actively trying to exclude black women. But it was designed without considering their experiences. It operated according to norms that centered white comfort, and it had become a space where subtle exclusions accumulated into clear patterns of who belonged and who didn't. David realized that intentions didn't matter if outcomes were harmful, and that diversity meant nothing if the environment made diverse employees feel isolated and unwelcome. David had a choice. He could acknowledge the problem and do nothing, could make cosmetic changes that wouldn't address root causes, or he could treat this as a wake-up call that required fundamental changes to how his company thought about inclusion. To his credit, David chose transformation. He brought his leadership team together and shared what he'd learned without sugarcoating or minimizing. Some leaders were defensive, arguing that the company couldn't control how employees socialized or force people to be more welcoming. But David pushed back. We created this space and these norms. We can change them. And if our cafeteria is making black employees feel excluded, what else are we getting wrong throughout the company? David and his team, working with Angela Martinez and a consultant who specialized in organizational inclusion, undertook a comprehensive assessment of company culture beyond just the cafeteria. They conducted listening sessions with employees of color, reviewed promotion and advancement data, examined patterns in who got assigned to high-visibility projects, analyzed meeting dynamics, and investigated the informal networks that shaped opportunities. What they discovered was that the cafeteria was symptom, not cause. The company had systemic issues with inclusion that manifested across multiple domains. Black employees were less likely to be promoted, more likely to be assigned lower-profile work, more likely to report feeling unsupported by managers, and more likely to leave the company than white employees with similar performance. The cafeteria exclusion was just one visible manifestation of broader patterns, where the company's culture centered white norms and made employees of color feel like outsiders. The changes David implemented were comprehensive. For the cafeteria specifically, he hired a more diverse kitchen staff, including chefs with expertise in African, Caribbean, and soul food cuisines, and he expanded menus to genuinely reflect the diversity of his workforce. He redesigned the seating to include smaller, more intimate spaces that didn't require sitting at large communal tables where minority employees might feel exposed. He instituted structured lunches once a week, where employees from different departments were randomly assigned to eat together, removing some of the social anxiety about where to sit and explicitly creating opportunities for cross-departmental relationship building that didn't depend on existing networks. He created explicit norms about cafeteria behavior, posting guidelines about respectful conversation, creating a mechanism for reporting uncomfortable incidents, making clear that this was a professional space where the same behavior standards applied as in any other part of the office. But David knew the cafeteria changes alone wouldn't solve the underlying problems. He implemented company-wide reforms addressing the systemic exclusions his assessment had revealed. He revised promotion processes to reduce subjective judgments and bias, requiring clear documentation of accomplishments and ensuring that employees of color had equal access to high-visibility projects that led to advancement. He implemented mandatory training on inclusive meeting practices, teaching managers to notice and interrupt patterns where some people were talked over or excluded. He created employee resource groups specifically for employees of color and gave them real power to shape policies. He tied manager performance reviews and bonuses to demonstrated progress on inclusion metrics, making it clear that creating an equitable environment wasn't optional or secondary, but a core job responsibility. David also did something that many leaders resist. He publicly acknowledged that his company had failed Black employees and that he as CEO bore responsibility for systems that had perpetuated exclusion, even when he hadn't intended that outcome. In a company-wide meeting, David shared what he'd learned about the cafeteria and about broader patterns of exclusion, apologized for creating an environment where Black women didn't feel welcome, and committed to ongoing change. He made clear that this wasn't a one-time initiative or a diversity box to check, but a fundamental shift in how the company would operate going forward. He invited accountability, asking employees to hold leadership to the commitments being made. The response to David's transparency and commitments was mixed. Some employees, particularly white employees who'd never experienced exclusion, were uncomfortable with the conversation and felt like the company was making everything about race. Some thought the focus on Black women's cafeteria experiences was making a big deal out of nothing. But the employees of color, and particularly the Black women who'd shared their experiences, responded with cautious hope. They'd seen performative diversity efforts before that changed nothing fundamental. They'd watched companies respond to complaints with training that was ignored or policy changes that were unenforced. They were waiting to see if David's commitment would translate into real, sustained change, or if it would fade once the initial attention passed. The proof came over the following years. 3 years after David's conversations about the cafeteria, TechVision's retention and advancement metrics for Black employees had improved dramatically. The company had promoted 12 Black women to senior positions, more than the previous 8 years combined. Employee surveys showed significant increases in how Black employees rated the company's inclusiveness and their sense of belonging. Most tellingly, badge data showed that cafeteria usage among Black women had increased from 12% to 67%. Not everyone used it, which was fine, but the majority now felt comfortable doing so because the space had genuinely changed. The cafeteria wasn't perfect, and exclusions hadn't been eliminated entirely, but it was noticeably different, more diverse in both the people present and the food offered, with clearer norms about respectful behavior and mechanisms for addressing problems when they arose. The broader changes had transformed TechVision's culture in ways that extended beyond Black women to benefit all employees who'd felt marginalized. Other women of color reported feeling more included. Other employees who'd felt pressure to hide their identities felt safer being open. Employees from working-class backgrounds felt less alienated by the class assumptions that pervaded tech culture. White employees who genuinely wanted to work in diverse environments but hadn't known how to create that felt empowered to speak up about exclusions they witnessed. The changes weren't perfect, and they didn't solve all problems, but they represented genuine progress that employees could see and feel. David's story became somewhat famous in tech circles. He spoke at conferences about what he'd learned, wrote articles about the importance of actually listening to marginalized employees, and consulted with other companies facing similar inclusion challenges. But what he emphasized in all these platforms was that this shouldn't have been remarkable. Everything he'd learned could have been known years earlier if he'd been paying attention, if he'd created systems for hearing from employees who were having different experiences than he expected, if he'd been willing to acknowledge that good intentions didn't guarantee good outcomes. The fact that simply asking Black women why they weren't using the cafeteria and actually listening to their answers had been revelatory was itself an indictment of how little most companies actually understand their employees' experiences. The broader lessons from David's story extend far beyond one tech company's cafeteria. Research consistently shows that employee spaces designed without considering diverse experiences often perpetuate exclusions that leadership is oblivious to. A 2022 study by McKinsey and Company on workplace inclusion found that Black women report the lowest sense of belonging of any demographic group in corporate America, that they face unique combinations of racial and gender bias, and that they often feel unable to be authentic at work because of stereotypes and microaggressions. The study found that Black women are more likely than others to report feeling like they need to provide more evidence of their competence, more likely to have their judgment questioned in their area of expertise, and more likely to report being on guard at work. These findings align exactly with what Jasmine, Keisha, Tamara, and the other Black women at TechVision reported about the cafeteria and the broader company culture. Another study by the Center for Talent Innovation found that 64% of Black women report that they can't bring their full selves to work, compared to 40% of white women. They describe code-switching their language, appearance, and behavior to avoid triggering stereotypes, and they report that this constant self-monitoring is exhausting and harmful to their well-being and career advancement. The cafeteria story illustrates how this dynamic operates. The decision to avoid the cafeteria wasn't about food preferences, but about managing the psychological cost of navigating a space that required constant self-monitoring and subjected them to microaggressions and exclusion. Understanding these dynamics is essential for creating genuinely inclusive workplaces rather than just diverse ones. David's experience also illustrates an important distinction between diversity and inclusion. TechVision had diversity, 18% Black employees, multiple Black women in various roles, demographic representation that looked good on paper and in recruiting materials. But diversity without inclusion is just optics. The Black women were present in the company, but not fully included in its culture, not given equal access to the informal networks and spaces where relationships and opportunities were built, not able to be fully themselves without constant self-monitoring and code switching. They were diverse hires, but not genuinely welcomed members of the community. David learned that true inclusion required designing systems and spaces with marginalized employees' experiences in mind from the start, not as an afterthought or accommodation. The story raises important questions for leaders and companies beyond tech. How many company spaces and practices are designed without considering how they might feel to employees from marginalized backgrounds? How many policies and norms assume everyone has the same experience and access? How often do leaders mistake diversity metrics for genuine inclusion without actually investigating whether diverse employees feel welcome and supported? How many exclusions are invisible to leaders because they're not personally experiencing them and haven't created mechanisms to hear from those who are? David's awakening came because he paid attention to a pattern and asked questions. But how many leaders never notice the patterns because they're not personally affected by them? If you're a leader or manager, David's story offers a blueprint. Pay attention to patterns in who uses company spaces and participates in company culture. Don't assume that silence means satisfaction. Create safe opportunities for marginalized employees to share their experiences honestly. Listen without defensiveness when people tell you about exclusions you didn't intend, and commit to changes that address root causes rather than just symptoms. Most importantly, understand that inclusion requires ongoing effort and attention, not a one-time initiative or policy change. It requires building systems that center marginalized employees' experiences rather than treating inclusion as something to add on to spaces and practices designed for dominant groups. If you're an employee who's experienced exclusions like the Black women at TechVision, Know that your experiences are valid even if others don't see or acknowledge them. The decision to protect your well-being by avoiding spaces that feel hostile isn't weakness or self-segregation. It's self-preservation in environments that weren't designed for you. And if you have the energy and safety to speak up about exclusions, know that you might encounter defensiveness or dismissal, but you might also encounter leaders like David who genuinely want to learn and change. The risk of speaking up is real and shouldn't be minimized, but silence guarantees nothing will change. Here's the ultimate takeaway. David's company had spent $2 million building a beautiful cafeteria that was supposed to serve all employees, but it had never occurred to anyone during planning that Black women might have different experiences in that space than white employees. That failure of imagination, the assumption that what works for the majority will work for everyone, is replicated across countless company policies, spaces, and practices. The cafeteria was just one visible example of a systemic problem where companies designed for white employees and then wondered why diverse employees struggled or left. True inclusion requires leaders to actively investigate whether marginalized employees are having different experiences, to believe those employees when they describe exclusions, and to make genuine changes rather than just acknowledging problems and moving on. If this story changed how you think about workplace inclusion, about the difference between diversity and belonging, or about how even well-intentioned spaces can perpetuate exclusion, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that reveal hidden dynamics in workplaces and society. Share this with leaders, managers, HR professionals, or anyone working to create genuinely inclusive environments. Drop a comment sharing your own experiences with workplace exclusions. Have you ever avoided company spaces or activities because they felt unwelcoming? What would need to change for you to feel genuinely included? These conversations matter because David's story proves that change is possible when leaders actually listen. But that change doesn't happen unless people speak up and leaders pay attention to patterns they'd rather not see.